I never thought my life would come to this, a once proud, independent man reduced to a helpless figure, crushed beneath the relentless weight of medical debt. It was a stroke that started it all, an unexpected, silent thief that stole not just my health but my future as well. I remember the moment it happened, the sudden numbness in my left side, the slurring of words, and then the darkness. When I woke up in the hospital, groggy from the medication and disoriented, I didn't realize that this was the beginning of a nightmare far worse than the stroke itself. The hospital bills piled up quickly, each one more daunting than the last. Insurance barely made a dent in the mountain of debt that seemed to grow larger by the day. I tried to work, to get back on my feet, but the stroke had left me weaker, slower. The jobs I once took for granted slipped through my fingers, and soon enough I was unemployed, my savings drained, and my pride in tatters. Every day was a struggle to keep the lights on, to pay for the medication that kept me alive, and to stave off the creditors who called constantly, their voices a constant reminder of my failure. It was in this state of despair that I first heard from Benjamin Financial. The name meant nothing to me at the time, just another faceless corporation in a city full of them. I was sitting in my small, cluttered apartment, staring at a stack of bills I couldn't pay when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, almost soothing, as it introduced itself as a representative of Benjamin Financial. They had heard about my situation. The voice said, and they wanted to help. Help. The word was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I clung to it, even as a part of me remained suspicious. Who were these people? Why would they want to help someone like me? But desperation has a way of silencing those doubts, of making you see what you want to see. I agreed to meet with them, hoping, praying, that this might be the break I needed. The meeting was set for the next day, and I spent the night in restless anticipation. The next morning, I found myself in front of a towering glass building in the heart of West Los Angeles, feeling small and out of place among the sharp-dressed professionals that moved with purpose all around me. The lobby was vast and gleaming, a monument to corporate success, and I felt a pang of envy as I imagined the lives of the people who worked there, lives free from the crushing burden of debt. I was escorted up to the top floor, where I was greeted by Lena, the secretary. She was beautiful, with a calm, polite demeanor that put me somewhat at ease, though there was something about her that felt off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She led me into an office that was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was opulent, with a full bar, plush leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city below. The wealth and power that radiated from that room were almost palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with a creeping sense of dread. Daniel Kingsley, the vice president of philanthropy, was waiting for me. He was a tall, charismatic man, with an easy smile and a voice that exuded confidence and authority. He welcomed me warmly, making small talk as he offered me a drink from the bar, which I declined. I was too nervous, too eager to find out what this was all about. I sat down across from him, my hands clenched in my lap, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked him why I was there. Kingsley didn't waste any time. He explained that Benjamin Financial had a program, an exclusive, highly confidential program, for people in my situation. They could erase my debt, wipe it out completely, if I was willing to do something for them. As he spoke, my mind raced, trying to anticipate what he might ask of me. Maybe they wanted me to sign up for some experimental medical treatment, or perhaps they had a job for me, something dangerous or illegal. I could handle that, I told myself. I could do whatever it took to be free of this debt. But then Kingsley said the words that would change everything. He leaned forward, his smile fading slightly as he told me about the ritual, a human sacrifice performed during the next blood moon, in exchange for the erasure of my debt. I stared at him, stunned, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. This had to be a joke, some kind of sick test to see how desperate I really was. But Kingsley's expression was deadly serious, and as he spoke, I realized with growing horror that he meant every word. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Kingsley gave me time to think about his offer, reassuring me that there was no rush, that I could take all the time I needed to make my decision. But as I left the office, my mind was in turmoil. How could I even consider such a thing? And yet, how could I not? The weight of my debt was like a noose around my neck, tightening with each passing day. I was trapped, with no way out, and Benchman Financial had just offered me a lifeline, albeit one that came with a terrible price. I spent the rest of the day wandering the streets of Los Angeles, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The city seemed different, darker, as if I was seeing it for the first time with new, fearful eyes. The people around me, going about their daily lives, were oblivious to the dark undercurrents that ran beneath the surface of this city, the hidden deals and secret rituals that kept places like Benchman Financial in power. By the time I returned to my apartment that evening, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing with thoughts of the offer Kingsley had made. I wanted to believe that there was another way out, that I could find a solution that didn't involve bloodshed. But deep down, I knew that I was running out of options. The walls were closing in, and the weight of my debt was crushing the life out of me. And so, as I lay there in the darkness, I found myself wondering, how far would I go to be free? The next morning, I woke with a heavy weight in my chest, the events of the previous day pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. I had hoped that a night's sleep might bring some clarity, some way to rationalize what I had been offered, but instead, I felt more lost than ever. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now seemed like a cage, the walls closing in around me as I replayed Kingsley's words over and over in my mind. A human sacrifice. The idea was so foreign, so grotesque, that it felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And yet, it was all too real. By mid-morning, the phone rang. It was Lena, her voice as calm and composed as it had been the day before. She told me that Mr. Kingsley would like to meet with me again, this time in a more private setting. There was something in her tone that made it clear this was not a request. I agreed, more out of a sense of resignation than anything else. What else could I do? I was already in too deep, and some part of me needed to understand the full extent of what I was dealing with. Perhaps, I thought, if I knew more, I could find a way out. The car that picked me up from my apartment was sleek and black, the kind of car that made no noise as it slid through the streets. The driver didn't speak a word, and I didn't ask any questions. The city blurred past us, a haze of concrete and glass, as we made our way to an unknown destination. I felt like a man being led to his execution, the sense of impending doom growing with every passing minute. When we finally arrived, I found myself outside a nondescript building in a part of the city I didn't recognize. The driver motioned for me to get out, and I obeyed, my heart pounding in my chest. Lena was waiting for me inside, her expression as unreadable as ever. She led me down a series of long, dimly lit hallways, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. There was a strange smell in the air, something metallic and acrid that made my stomach turn. Finally, we reached a heavy door at the end of the corridor. Lena opened it and gestured for me to enter. I hesitated for just a moment, a small part of me screaming to turn back, to run as fast as I could. But then I stepped through the door, and it closed behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. The room I entered was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was large and dimly lit, with walls made of what looked like polished stone. In the center of the room was a raised platform, and on it lay a man, disheveled, filthy, and unconscious. He was dressed in ragged clothes, the kind worn by those who have been forgotten by society. A homeless man, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach. Kingsley stood beside the platform, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the horror that was about to unfold. Without a word, Kingsley picked up a ceremonial dagger that had been placed on a nearby table. It gleamed in the low light, its blade impossibly sharp. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him move with deliberate precision, positioning himself over the man on the platform. I wanted to shout. to stop him, but I was frozen in place, my body betraying me as I stood there in stunned silence. Kingsley's eyes met mine, and in that moment I saw something cold and alien in them, something devoid of any humanity. With a single swift motion, Kingsley brought the dagger down, slicing through the man's chest with practiced ease. The sound of it was terrible, a wet, sickening noise that made me gag. Blood pooled around the man's body, dark and thick, as his life drained away before my eyes. The man never woke, never screamed. It was as if he had been prepared for this, his fate sealed long before I had ever stepped into that room. I felt my knees go weak, the bile rising in my throat as I struggled to comprehend the reality of what I had just witnessed. Kingsley wiped the blade clean with a cloth, his movements meticulous, almost ritualistic. Then he turned to me, his expression serene, as if he had just completed a mundane task. "This is the reality of the world you've stepped into, Ethan," he said softly, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Benchman Financial does not merely erase debts. We demand something in return. Something of great value." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This is the price, a life for a life." It's a simple equation, really. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick and useless. All I could do was stare at the lifeless body on the platform, the horror of what I had just witnessed sinking into my bones. Kingsley continued, his tone almost paternal as he explained the history of Benchman Financial and its ties to the ancient demon Nereus. He spoke of the rituals that had been performed for generations, the blood that had been spilled to maintain the corporation's power and influence. It was all so matter-of-fact, so detached from the reality of the violence that had just occurred. By the time Kingsley finished, I felt as though I was drowning, my mind unable to process the enormity of what he had revealed. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about something much darker, something that went beyond the physical world. I had stepped into a nightmare, and there was no waking up from it. Kingsley placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, almost reassuring. "You have a decision to make, Ethan," he said, his voice gentle. "But remember, the clock is ticking. The blood moon is coming, and with it, your opportunity to be free." I left that room in a daze, Lena guiding me back through the corridors and out to the waiting car. The drive back to my apartment was a blur, my thoughts a chaotic mess of fear, confusion, and despair. When I finally stumbled through my front door, I collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. I had never felt so powerless, so completely at the mercy of forces beyond my control. The weight of my debt, which had seemed so crushing just days before, now paled in comparison to the horror that Benchman Financial had placed on my shoulders. I spent the rest of the day in a state of numb shock. The image of the man on the platform burned into my mind. How had it come to this? How had I, an ordinary man, become entangled in something so monstrous? I wanted to believe that there was still a way out, that I could escape this nightmare without blood on my hands. But deep down, I knew that Kingsley was right. The clock was ticking, and the blood moon was drawing near. Time was running out, and with it, my chances of finding another way. As night fell, I found myself staring out the window, the city lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there, Kingsley and his associates were preparing for the ritual, making plans that would forever alter the course of my life. I felt a cold dread settle in the pit of my stomach, the reality of my situation sinking in with terrifying clarity. I was trapped, caught in a web of deceit and bloodshed, and no matter how much I wanted to deny it, I knew that there was only one way out. The question was, how far was I willing to go to find my freedom? The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and dread. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man on the platform, his lifeless body seared into my memory. The weight of the decision I had to make pressed down on me, crushing any semblance of peace or normalcy that I had left. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. My mind was consumed by the impossible choice that loomed ahead. The debt that had once seemed insurmountable now felt almost trivial compared to the moral horror I was being asked to commit. But as the days dragged on, the reality of my situation became harder to ignore. Without some kind of miracle, I was going to lose everything. I started avoiding my girlfriend, Olivia. How could I face her knowing the monstrous decision that was gnawing at my soul? I couldn't let her see how far I had fallen, how close I was to crossing a line from which there would be no return. The lies I told her to keep her from worrying grew more elaborate, more tangled, until I could barely keep track of them myself. I was sinking deeper into a pit of despair, and I could see no way out. The moments we spent together, once filled with warmth and comfort, now felt like a cruel reminder of the life I was about to destroy. One night, as I sat alone in the darkened apartment, the crushing weight of it all became too much to bear. I found myself picking up the phone, my hands trembling as I dialed a number I never thought I would call. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered on the other end. Tanya Morales. I had met her briefly before, a woman who had once walked the same terrible path I now faced. Her voice was shaky, and I could hear the weariness in her tone as she asked who was calling. I introduced myself, stumbling over my words, trying to explain that I needed to talk, that I needed to understand what I was truly up against. Tanya agreed to meet me in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, far from the prying eyes of Benjamin Financial. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting in a corner booth, a scarf pulled tightly around her neck, as if to ward off some invisible chill. The years since her ordeal had taken a toll on her. She looked haunted, like someone who had seen too much, who had done too much. Her eyes met mine with a mix of pity and understanding as I slid into the booth opposite her. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The cafe was quiet, the hum of conversation and clinking of cutlery filling the space between us. Finally, I found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in my mind since that fateful meeting with Kingsley. "How did you do it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How did you bring yourself to?" I couldn't finish the sentence, but Tanya knew what I meant. Her gaze dropped to the table, her hands clasping a coffee cup as if it were a lifeline. She told me about her own sacrifice, how she had been driven to the brink by the same kind of debt that was crushing me now. A single mother, drowning in bills, with no one to turn to and no way out. She described the moment she had made the decision, the numbness that had settled over her as she went through with it, almost as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. And then, when it was done, the crushing guilt that followed, the realization that she could never undo what she had done, that she had traded her soul for temporary relief. But it was what came after that truly terrified me. Tanya spoke of the nightmares that had plagued her since the ritual, the visions of the person she had sacrificed, their lifeless eyes staring back at her every time she closed her own. The money from Benjamin Financial had come, and the debt was gone, but it hadn't saved her. Instead, it had condemned her to a life of torment, a prison of her own making. As she spoke, her voice trembled, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. "I thought I was saving my children," she said, her voice breaking. "But all I did was damn us all." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I realized then that the real price of the ritual wasn't just the life I would have to take, but the soul I would lose in the process. Tanya's story was a glimpse into my own future if I chose to go through with Kingsley's offer. A future where the debt might be gone, but the cost would be far greater than I had ever imagined. I could feel the walls closing in again, the noose tightening around my neck, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of the decision I was being forced to make. After our conversation, I left the cafe in a daze, the cold night air doing little to clear the fog in my mind. The streets were quiet, the city around me oblivious to the torment I was enduring. I wandered aimlessly for hours, my thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, guilt, and desperation. I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't become the monster that Kingsley wanted me to be. But as the dawn approached, I realized that I didn't have a choice. The debt was real, the threat of losing everything was real, and Kingsley's offer was the only lifeline I had left. I returned to my apartment just as the first light of day was creeping over the horizon. Exhausted and defeated, I collapsed onto the bed, my mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The reality of my situation was inescapable. I was out of options, out of time. If I didn't act soon, the debt would consume me, and I would lose everything I had fought so hard to keep. But could I really go through with it? Could I cross that line and live with the consequences? The questions echoed in my mind as sleep finally claimed me, offering no answers, only the promise of more nightmares. In the days that followed, I withdrew even further from Olivia, my guilt and fear driving a wedge between us. She could sense something was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. How could I? How could I explain the terrible choice I was facing, the monstrous act I was considering? So I lied. I told her I was just stressed, that the debt was weighing on me, but that I would figure something out. I reassured her that everything would be fine, even as I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same again. The days dragged on, and the blood moon drew closer. The pressure was mounting, the walls of my life crumbling around me as I wrestled with the impossible choice before me. The desperation was like a poison, seeping into every aspect of my life, clouding my judgment, eroding my resolve. I could feel myself slipping, losing control, as the reality of what I was being asked to do became clearer with each passing day. The time for indecision was over. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it soon. The question was, could I live with the choice I was about to make? As the days slipped away and the blood moon loomed ever closer, I knew I could no longer avoid the inevitable. The pressure inside me had reached a breaking point, the weight of the decision bearing down on me with unbearable force. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and when I did manage to close my eyes, the nightmares were relentless. Images of the man on the platform, of Tanya's haunted eyes, and of the monstrous act I was about to commit swirled together in a ceaseless, suffocating fog. I was a man unraveling, coming apart at the seams, and I had no idea how to put myself back together. It was with this sense of dread that I found myself once again in the opulent office of Daniel Kingsley. The place that had once seemed so luxurious, so untouchable, now felt like the antechamber to hell itself. Lena greeted me as she always did, with that same unnervingly calm smile, and ushered me into Kingsley's office. He was waiting for me, his expression inscrutable, as if he already knew the decision I had made before I had even spoken a word. I felt like a man walking to the gallows, and perhaps, in a way, I was. Kingsley wasted no time. He asked if I had made my decision, and I nodded, the words catching in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud, to admit that I was ready to go through with something so heinous, but he understood, and that terrifying predatory smile spread across his face. He told me that everything was prepared, that all that was left was for me to fulfill my part of the bargain. He would take care of the rest. As he spoke, I felt a cold chill settle over me, a realization that there was no turning back now. I was in too deep, and the only way out was through. Then, with a casualness that took my breath away, Kingsley revealed the final, horrific detail. The intended victim, the person I was to sacrifice, wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some faceless, nameless person plucked from the streets. No, it was Olivia. My Olivia. The woman I loved, the woman who had stood by me through everything, was to be the price I paid to erase my debt. I felt the ground drop out from under me, my vision blurring as the full impact of what he was saying hit me. I had prepared myself for many things, but not for this. Not for the idea that I would have to sacrifice the one person in this world who still cared for me. I couldn't breathe. The room spun, and I clutched the edge of Kingsley's desk, trying to steady myself. Olivia. How could this be possible? How could they ask this of me? The blood drained from my face, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. Kingsley continued talking, his voice a distant drone in my ears, as he explained why Olivia's sacrifice was so important, how her blood would seal the ritual in a way that would guarantee success. But I couldn't hear him, couldn't focus on anything but the image of Olivia, her warm smile, her kind eyes, and the knowledge that I was supposed to take her life with my own hands. Desperation clawed at my insides, and I found myself pleading with Kingsley, begging him to reconsider, to find someone else, anyone else. But his expression hardened, and he shook his head, telling me in no uncertain terms that this was the way it had to be. There was no other option. Olivia was the one. The more I begged, the colder he became, until finally he simply dismissed me, telling me to go home and prepare. The ritual would take place tomorrow night, under the light of the blood moon, and I had better be ready. I left the office in a daze, my mind numb with shock and horror. How could I do this? How could I sacrifice the woman I loved to save myself from this crushing debt? But as I walked the streets, the other side of my mind, the darker, more desperate side, began to whisper that this was the only way. The debt was real, and if I didn't act, I would lose everything. And wasn't it better to sacrifice one life to save two? Wasn't that the logical choice? But the very thought of it made me sick to my core, tearing me apart inside as I wrestled with the impossibility of the decision. I returned to my apartment, where Olivia was waiting for me, her face lighting up as I walked through the door. She had no idea what I had just been asked to do, no clue about the horror that was looming over us. I wanted to tell her everything, to confess the terrible choice I was facing, but how could I? How could I look into her eyes and tell her that I was supposed to kill her to save myself? The guilt and fear were suffocating. And so, once again, I lied. I told her I was just tired, that the debt was weighing on me, but that everything would be fine. She believed me, as she always did, and I hated myself for it. That night, as Olivia slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had to do. The clock was ticking, and with each passing second, the blood moon drew closer. I knew I was running out of time, but the thought of going through with it, of taking Olivia's life, was too much to bear. I wanted to run, to take her and disappear, but I knew that wasn't an option. Kingsley would find us, and the consequences would be even worse. I was trapped, caught in a web of fear and desperation, with no way out. As the first light of dawn crept through the window, I made my decision. I would go through with it. I had no choice. The debt was too great, the consequences of failing too dire. But as I resolved myself to this horrific act, I felt a part of my soul die. I knew that even if I succeeded, even if the debt was erased, I would never be the same again. The person I was, the man who loved Olivia, who had once dreamed of a better life, was gone. All that was left was a hollow shell, a man willing to do anything to escape the darkness that had consumed his life. The day passed in a blur, my thoughts a chaotic mess of fear, guilt, and resignation. I avoided Olivia as much as I could, unable to face her without the weight of what I was about to do crushing down on me. As the evening approached, I found myself in the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The man who stared back at me was a stranger, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt. I had become something I didn't recognize, and it terrified me. But there was no turning back now. The ritual was set, and I was committed. As the sun set and the blood moon began to rise, I prepared myself for what was to come. I dressed in the clothes Lena had provided, black and ceremonial, as if I were heading to a funeral, my own funeral, in a way. I went through the motions in a daze, my mind numb, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what I was about to do. And as the hour approached, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the unimaginable. Tonight, I would cross the line, and nothing would ever be the same again. The night of the blood moon had arrived, casting an eerie red glow over the city that only deepened my sense of impending doom. I had spent the day in a state of numb resignation, every action mechanical, devoid of thought or emotion. By the time night fell, I was no longer the man I once was. I had become something else, something darker. I was beyond fear, beyond guilt. I was simply a vessel for the terrible act I was about to commit. As the hour approached, I felt as if I were moving through a dream, everything around me hazy and distant. Lena arrived at my apartment just as the moon reached its zenith. She was as composed as ever, her presence somehow calming despite the horror that awaited us both. Without a word, she led me down to a waiting car, the same sleek, black vehicle that had taken me to that first meeting with Kingsley. But this time, there was no uncertainty, no lingering doubts. I was committed, and the only way forward was through. We drove in silence, the city passing by in a blur, until we arrived at the towering building that housed Benjamin Financial. The sight of it, bathed in the blood-red light of the moon, sent a shiver down my spine, but I pushed the feeling aside. There was no room for hesitation now. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The usual bustling activity of the office had been replaced by a heavy, almost oppressive silence. Lena led me to the private elevator, the one that descended to the hidden temple I had glimpsed before. As the doors closed behind us, sealing us in, I felt the air grow colder, the familiar metallic tang of the temple's atmosphere creeping into my lungs. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of the life I was about to take, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was the price I had to pay. When the elevator doors slid open, the surreal, otherworldly space of the temple greeted me once again. The shifting colors, the impossible architecture, all of it felt even more disorienting than before, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around us. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and something else, something darker, more sinister. The temple was alive with the energy of the blood moon, the walls pulsing with a malevolent light that seemed to seep into my skin, into my soul. I could feel the presence of something ancient, something hungry, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception. The board members were already there, gathered around the central platform where the ritual would take place. They were dressed in robes of deep crimson, their faces obscured by shadow, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and calculating. These were the true masters of Benjamin Financial, the architects of its dark success. I felt a wave of revulsion wash over me, but I pushed it down, burying it deep. I couldn't afford to feel anything now, not if I was going to survive this. Kingsley was there too, standing beside the platform, his expression one of serene confidence. He greeted me with a nod, as if we were simply business partners about to close a deal. There was no trace of doubt or hesitation in his demeanor. He was in complete control, and he knew it. Lena stepped forward, handing me the ceremonial dagger, its blade gleaming in the unnatural light. My hand shook as I took it, the weight of it almost too much to bear, but I had no choice. The ritual demanded blood, and it was my hand that had to deliver it. Olivia was brought in then, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She had been told nothing, kept in the dark until this very moment. As she was led to the platform, her gaze met mine, and the terror I saw there nearly broke me. She called out my name, her voice trembling, begging me to tell her what was happening, but I couldn't answer. I couldn't bring myself to speak, to tell her that I was about to betray her in the worst possible way. I had to turn my heart to stone, to shut out the sound of her voice, the sight of her tears. This was the only way. Kingsley began to recite the incantation, his voice low and rhythmic, filling the temple with a dark, pulsing energy. The board members joined in, their voices rising in unison, creating a chant that resonated deep within my bones. The air crackled with power, the very walls of the temple seeming to bend and shift with the force of it. I could feel the presence of Neris growing stronger, its malevolent hunger reaching out, demanding the sacrifice it had been promised. The dagger felt like ice in my hand, its weight pulling me down into the darkness. I moved toward the platform, each step feeling like it took an eternity. Olivia's eyes were locked on mine, filled with a mixture of terror and confusion. She struggled against her bonds, desperate to escape, to understand why this was happening. I wanted to tell her I was sorry, that I had no choice, but the words caught in my throat. The chant grew louder, more insistent, drowning out everything else. I was barely aware of Kingsley's voice urging me on, telling me that it was time, that the ritual could not be delayed any longer. The moment had arrived. I raised the dagger, my hand trembling as I tried to steel myself for what I was about to do. Olivia's voice broke through the chant, a cry of my name that pierced through the fog of fear and desperation that had clouded my mind. It was a plea, a final desperate attempt to reach the part of me that was still human, still capable of love. And in that moment, something inside me shattered. I couldn't do it. I couldn't take her life. The cost was too high, the price too great. I had been willing to sacrifice anything to escape my debt, but not this, not her. Before I could fully comprehend what was happening, Olivia's expression changed. The confusion and fear were still there, but something else had taken hold, a fierce determination, a spark of defiance. She wasn't going to let this happen. Not to her, not to us. And in a flash, everything shifted. With a strength I didn't know she possessed, Olivia broke free of her bonds, her movements quick and precise. Before I could react, she had seized the dagger from my hand, her grip steady as she turned to face Kingsley. In that moment, time seemed to slow. The chant faltered, the board members recoiling in shock as they realized what was happening. Kingsley's eyes widened, his confidence evaporating as he saw the dagger now aimed at him. Olivia's expression was one of cold resolve. The woman I had known transformed into someone fierce, someone who would fight to the very end. And then, with a single, fluid motion, she plunged the dagger into Kingsley's chest, her aim true, her resolve unshakable. The temple erupted in chaos. The chant shattered, the air filled with the screams of the board members as the power they had summoned turned against them. The walls of the temple began to collapse, the once solid stone now twisting and crumbling under the weight of the broken ritual. Kingsley fell to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief, the life draining from him as the dagger did its work. And as he died, the presence of Neris surged, its fury unleashed, its hunger no longer satisfied by the sacrifice it had been promised. Olivia grabbed my hand, pulling me toward the exit as the temple continued to collapse around us. The ground shook beneath our feet, the air filled with the deafening roar of the dying ritual. I could barely think, barely process what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. We had to get out. We ran, our footsteps echoing in the crumbling temple, the world around us falling apart as the ancient power that had sustained it unraveled. And as we fled, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, terror, and something else. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. We barely made it out of the collapsing temple alive. The walls were crumbling, the ground shifting beneath our feet as if the very foundation of the world was giving way. But Olivia pulled me forward with a strength I hadn't known she possessed, her grip on my hand firm and unyielding. My mind was a whirl of confusion and fear, but there was no time to think, no time to process what had just happened. All I could do was follow her lead, trusting that somehow she would get us out of this nightmare. The elevator doors slammed shut behind us just as the floor of the temple gave way entirely, sending a deafening crash reverberating through the chamber. For a moment, the elevator was plunged into darkness, the only sound our ragged breathing and the distant roar of the collapsing structure. Then, with a shudder, the elevator began to ascend, carrying us back up to the surface, away from the horrors below. I leaned against the wall, my body shaking with adrenaline, my mind struggling to grasp the reality of what had just occurred. Olivia stood beside me, her face pale but resolute. The dagger she had used to kill Kingsley was still in her hand, its blade stained with his blood. She didn't look at me, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her jaw set in determination. There was no relief in her expression, no sign of the fear or doubt that must have been coursing through her veins. She had acted out of pure instinct, out of a desperate need to survive. And in doing so, she had turned the entire ritual on its head. The man who had been in control, who had orchestrated this entire nightmare, was dead, and with him, the power that had held us captive was beginning to unravel. As the elevator ascended, I found my voice, though it was weak and trembling. "Olivia," I began, but I didn't know what to say. How could I possibly express the mix of emotions I was feeling? Relief, gratitude, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of awe at what she had done. But she didn't respond, didn't even look at me. She was still in survival mode. Her mind focused solely on getting us out of here alive. I could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the way her hand tightened around the dagger. There would be time for words later, if we survived this. The elevator doors opened to the familiar, opulent office space of Benchman Financial, but it was no longer the imposing fortress it had once seemed. The building felt hollow, lifeless, as if the dark energy that had sustained it had been sucked away with Kingsley's death. The board members were nowhere to be seen, the staff absent, the hallways empty and echoing with an eerie silence. It was as if the entire structure had been abandoned, left to decay in the wake of the ritual's failure. We moved quickly through the deserted halls, our footsteps the only sound in the vast, empty space. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but there were no clear answers, no easy explanations. What mattered now was getting out, putting as much distance between us and this place as possible. But even as we hurried toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, some remnant of the dark power that had ruled this place for so long. As we reached the lobby, a sense of urgency pushed us forward. We needed to leave before whatever was left of Benchman Financial's dark influence tried to reclaim us. The outside world was so close, the cool night air just beyond the glass doors, but it felt a million miles away. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and anticipation, as we pushed open the doors and stepped out into the night. The city was eerily quiet, the streets deserted, bathed in the blood-red light of the waning blood moon. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was no explosion of dark energy, no last-minute attempt to drag us back into the nightmare we had just escaped. We were free, at least for the moment. We walked in silence, our footsteps echoing through the empty streets. I didn't know where we were going, and I don't think Olivia did either. All that mattered was getting away, putting as much distance between us and Benchman Financial as we could. The further we walked, the more the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. We had survived. We had escaped the clutches of a power far beyond our understanding. But the cost, both physical and emotional, was more than I could fully comprehend in that moment. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, we reached a small park on the outskirts of the city. It was a place we had visited before, back when life was simpler, before the debt, and the desperation had taken over. We collapsed onto a bench, our bodies exhausted, our minds reeling. The dagger, now clean, was still clutched in Olivia's hand, a grim reminder of what she had done, of the life she had taken to save us both. For a long time, we sat there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us like a suffocating blanket. I wanted to say something, to thank her, to apologize, to do anything to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. How could they? What could I possibly say that would make any of this better? The truth was, nothing could. We had crossed a line, both of us, and there was no going back. Eventually, Olivia spoke, her voice soft, almost distant. I had no choice, she said, her gaze fixed on the ground. It was him or us. There was no emotion in her voice, no trace of the woman I had once known. She was right, of course. Kingsley had left her no choice. But the act had changed her, had changed us both, in ways we couldn't yet understand. I know, I replied, my voice hollow. But that doesn't make it any easier, does it? She shook her head, and for the first time, I saw tears glistening in her eyes. No, she whispered. It doesn't. The city around us was beginning to wake up, the first signs of dawn creeping over the horizon. The blood moon was fading, its eerie glow slowly replaced by the pale light of day. But even as the darkness receded, I knew that the shadows it had left behind would linger. We had survived, but the cost of that survival would haunt us for the rest of our lives. As we sat there, watching the sun rise over the city, I realized that our ordeal was far from over. The debt might be gone, Kingsley might be dead, but the consequences of our actions were just beginning to unfold. We had escaped one nightmare, only to enter another, a life marked by the knowledge of what we had done, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But for now, we were alive, and that was enough. We would take each day as it came, one step at a time, and hope that somehow we could find a way to live with the choices we had made. The days that followed our escape from Benjamin Financial felt like living in a strange, distorted version of reality. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me every moment, making it difficult to think clearly, to even breathe without the memory of that night creeping into my mind. Olivia and I moved through the motions of daily life like shadows, barely speaking, barely connecting. The bond that had once held us together felt frayed, almost beyond repair, as if the very act of surviving had driven a wedge between us. The city around us continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the nightmare we had endured. People went about their lives, unaware of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of this place, a darkness we had glimpsed but barely escaped. I found myself watching them with a mixture of envy and resentment. How lucky they were, how blissfully ignorant of the terrible choices that could be forced upon them when the right or wrong circumstances aligned. I envied their innocence, even as I knew it was something I could never reclaim. Olivia and I didn't talk much about what had happened. The words seemed too heavy, too dangerous to speak aloud. We both knew what we had done, what she had done, but discussing it felt like opening a wound that might never heal. Instead, we carried our guilt and fear in silence, each of us dealing with it in our own way. She spent long hours alone, walking the city streets, lost in thought, while I tried, and failed, to return to some semblance of normalcy. But there was no going back, not really. The person I had been before all of this was gone, and what was left was just a hollow echo of that man. The nightmares came almost every night. I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the image of Kingsley's face, twisted in shock and pain, burned into my mind. I could still feel the temple collapsing around us, hear the roar of the ancient power that had been unleashed, and see Olivia's eyes as she plunged the dagger into Kingsley's chest. Those moments replayed over and over in my mind, refusing to let me rest. It was as if the ritual had left a scar on my soul, one that would never fully heal. Olivia had her own demons to wrestle with. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she withdrew further into herself with each passing day. The strength and determination that had driven her to act that night seemed to have drained away, leaving her a shadow of the woman she once was. I wanted to help her, to reach out and pull her back from the brink, but I didn't know how. I was struggling to keep myself afloat, barely able to deal with my own guilt and fear, let alone hers. We were two people adrift in a sea of uncertainty, desperately trying to find our way back to each other, but unsure if we ever could. One morning, after a particularly brutal night of nightmares, I decided that we couldn't stay in the city any longer. There were too many memories here, too many reminders of what had happened. Every street, every building seemed to echo with the ghosts of that night, and I knew that if we didn't leave, those ghosts would consume us both. I told Olivia as much, my voice trembling as I tried to explain that we needed to start over, somewhere far away from all of this. She didn't argue, didn't resist. She simply nodded, a look of quiet resignation in her eyes, as if she had known this moment was coming all along. We packed what little we had and left the city that same day, driving with no real destination in mind, just a vague sense that somewhere out there we might find a place where the shadows of our past couldn't reach us. The road stretched out before us, a ribbon of asphalt leading into the unknown, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could leave the darkness behind and find a way to heal. But even as I clung to that hope, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The memories would follow us, the guilt would linger, and the choices we had made would haunt us for the rest of our lives. As the miles slipped by, I glanced over at Olivia, her face turned toward the window, her expression unreadable. I wondered if she was thinking the same thing I was, if she, too, was hoping that distance might somehow dull the pain, make it easier to bear. But I didn't ask. We had both become accustomed to the silence, to the unspoken agreement that some things were better left unsaid. I reached out and took her hand. And for a moment, she squeezed it in return, a small gesture of connection in the vast emptiness that had grown between us. The landscape outside the car window changed as we drove, the city giving way to open fields, to forests, to towns and villages where life seemed simpler, quieter. I found myself longing for that simplicity, for a life where the biggest worry was what to have for dinner or how to fix a leaky roof. But I knew it was a fantasy, a dream that could never be real for people like us. We had seen too much, done too much, to ever live that kind of life again. Finally, after days of driving, we found a small town nestled in the foothills of a mountain range. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the pace of life was slow and steady. It felt like the right place to stop, to try and rebuild something of the lives we had lost. We rented a small house on the edge of town, a modest place with a garden and a view of the mountains, and began the long, difficult process of trying to heal. The people in the town were kind, welcoming us with the warmth and hospitality that only small towns seem to offer. They didn't ask many questions, didn't pry into our past, for which I was grateful. They accepted us as we were, strangers looking for a fresh start. And in time, we began to settle into the rhythm of life there. But the darkness that had followed us didn't disappear. It lurked in the corners of our minds, in the shadows of our dreams, a constant reminder of what we had done and what we had lost. Olivia and I still struggled to connect, the distance between us growing with each passing day. We were two people bound by a shared trauma, but that trauma had also driven a wedge between us that neither of us knew how to remove. We moved through our days like ghosts, going through the motions but never really living. I could see the pain in her eyes, the guilt that gnawed at her, and I knew she saw the same in me. But we were both too afraid, too broken, to reach out to each other, and so we continued to drift, two lost souls in a small town that offered peace but no solace. As the months passed, I began to realize that the hope I had felt when we left the city was fading. The darkness that had taken root in us wasn't something that could be outrun or forgotten. It was a part of us now, woven into the very fabric of who we were. And as much as I wanted to believe that we could heal, that we could find a way to move forward, I knew that the scars of that night would never truly fade. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the town, I stood in the garden, looking out at the world we had chosen as our refuge. Olivia joined me, standing silently by my side. For a long time, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything we had been through hanging heavy in the air between us. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice soft, barely audible. "Do you think we'll ever be free of it?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the horizon. I didn't know how to answer, but I knew I had to try. I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we have to keep trying. We owe it to ourselves, to each other, to at least try." She nodded, her grip tightening on my hand, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw a glimmer of something in her eyes. Hope, or perhaps just a determination to keep going, despite everything. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And so we stood there, together, watching the sun dip below the mountains, casting the world into twilight. We had survived the nightmare, but the journey ahead was still uncertain, the path forward shrouded in darkness. But we would take that journey together, one step at a time, and maybe, just maybe, we would find a way to live with the choices we had made.